German soldiers expected to face a predictable enemy when they first encountered American forces during World War II. Many had already fought brutal campaigns across Poland, France, and especially the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. They believed they understood modern warfare. They believed they had seen everything. But within hours of engaging American troops, something felt very different. In the early clashes in North Africa during the North African Campaign, German units under experienced leadership quickly noticed a pattern that confused them. Small American units, sometimes lightly equipped and seemingly vulnerable, would suddenly unleash overwhelming firepower without warning. What began as a quiet skirmish could escalate into a storm of artillery within minutes. German officers wrote in reports that American forces had an unusual ability to call in artillery support with incredible speed. A single radio transmission from a forward observer could bring down a barrage so intense that it halted entire advances. Veterans who had survived the massive Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front found this precision even more unsettling. It was not just powerful, it was fast, coordinated, and accurate. One German soldier later described the experience as fighting an invisible enemy. You could not see the guns, you could not predict the strike. One moment there was silence, and the next, the ground itself seemed to explode. This created a psychological effect that spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers began to hesitate, unsure if every movement would trigger another devastating response. As the war moved into Italy during the Italian campaign, these impressions only deepened. German defensive positions, carefully chosen and heavily fortified, were repeatedly broken apart not just by infantry assaults, but by relentless artillery and air support working together. American forces did not always rely on maneuver or surprise in the traditional sense. Instead, they applied pressure through sheer volume and coordination of fire. This forced German commanders to rethink their assumptions. They had long valued tactical flexibility and initiative at the unit level, but against American forces, even a well-executed maneuver could be crushed by firepower before it had time to succeed. The battlefield itself seemed to belong to whoever could bring the most force to bear in the shortest amount of time, and increasingly, that was the Americans. There was also something else that stood out. American units, even when pushed back, often returned quickly. Destroyed equipment was replaced. Units that had taken losses were reinforced faster than expected. German soldiers began to notice that damaging American forces did not produce the same long-term effect it might have had against other enemies. It was as if the Americans could absorb punishment and continue fighting without losing momentum. These early encounters planted the seeds of a growing realization. The Americans were not fighting the same kind of war. Their strength was not just in individual soldiers or battlefield tactics, but in a system, one that connected communication, artillery, air power, and logistics into a single, overwhelming force. For German troops on the ground, this was deeply unsettling. War had always been dangerous, but now it felt unpredictable in a new way. You were no longer just fighting the men in front of you. You were fighting an entire machine that could respond instantly, relentlessly, and with devastating effect. By the time larger engagements began to unfold, many German soldiers had already formed their first impressions. They spoke quietly among themselves about what they had experienced. They warned new arrivals to be careful, to move quickly, to never stay in one place for too long. Because once the Americans found you, it was only a matter of minutes before the sky and the earth would come down on your position. And that was the moment when something changed. The fear was no longer just about the enemy you could see, it was about the power you couldn't.
Behind the barbed wire of prisoner of war camps, far from the chaos of the front lines, German soldiers believed they were finally out of danger. Captured officers and enlisted men were housed in relatively comfortable conditions compared to what they had endured during the war. They talked freely, shared stories, argued about strategy, and reflected on what they had seen. What they did not know was that many of these conversations were being secretly recorded. At locations like Fort Hunt in the United States and Trent Park in Britain, intelligence programs were quietly capturing the most honest assessments German soldiers would ever give. Hidden microphones were placed inside walls, light fixtures, and even furniture. There were no interrogators in the room, no pressure, no reason to lie. The prisoners believed they were speaking only to each other. Years later, historian Sönke Neitzel would uncover these transcripts and reveal something extraordinary. These were not official reports or propaganda statements. These were raw, unfiltered conversations between soldiers who had nothing left to prove. And across hundreds of recordings, a pattern began to emerge. Again and again, German prisoners returned to the same subject: fighting the Americans. They spoke about the speed of American artillery, often with a mix of frustration and disbelief. One officer described how a single radio call could bring down a barrage in less than 5 minutes. Another complained that any attempt to regroup or counterattack was immediately crushed by incoming fire. These were not exaggerated battlefield rumors. These were consistent observations repeated by men from different units, captured at different times, who had no way of coordinating their stories. But it wasn't just artillery that dominated their conversations. The prisoners also talked about the constant presence of American aircraft. Fighter bombers, they said, made movement during the day almost impossible. Columns that tried to advance were quickly spotted and attacked. Even supply lines, carefully hidden or moved at night, were not always safe. One soldier recalled how his unit had to remain completely still for hours, afraid that even the smallest movement would draw attention from the air. Another described the feeling of being hunted, not by a visible enemy, but by machines that could appear at any moment. The psychological pressure of this constant threat was something many of them struggled to explain, but all seemed to understand. What made these recordings even more revealing was the tone. These were not men trying to impress anyone. In fact, many of them were openly critical of their own situation. Some admitted that German forces simply could not match the scale of American production. They spoke about tanks being replaced overnight, about ammunition supplies that never seemed to run out, about an enemy that could sustain a level of intensity they could not. Even high-ranking officers, men who had commanded large formations, acknowledged this imbalance. They did not necessarily believe American soldiers were better trained or more experienced than their German counterparts, but they were increasingly convinced that it didn't matter. Because on the battlefield, firepower and resources were deciding the outcome. In one conversation, a group of officers discussed how difficult it had become to hold defensive positions. No matter how strong the fortifications were, they could be reduced by coordinated artillery and airstrikes. The traditional advantages of terrain and preparation were being eroded by sheer force. Perhaps the most striking part of these recordings is how consistent the message was. These conversations were recorded in different camps, in different countries, over several years. The soldiers came from different fronts: North Africa, Italy, France, and yet, when the topic turned to the Americans, the conclusions were almost identical. They spoke of speed, they spoke of power, and above all, they spoke of a kind of warfare that felt overwhelming. These were not statements made for history books. They were not filtered through official channels. They were the private thoughts of soldiers who believed no one else would ever hear them. And that is exactly why they are so important. Because in those quiet rooms, far from the battlefield, the reality of what they had faced began to take shape. Not as propaganda, not as rumor, but something far more powerful: honest testimony. And it all pointed to the same unsettling realization. By the time German forces encountered American troops in large-scale operations, it became clear that they were not just facing another army, but an entirely different system of war. It wasn't built around a single advantage, it was the combination of everything: artillery, air power, communication, and industry, working together with a level of coordination that many German soldiers found deeply unsettling. Again and again, captured troops described one specific moment that defined their experience: the moment when a single American radio operator, often positioned just behind the front line, would call in artillery support. Within minutes, sometimes even less, shells would begin to fall with incredible accuracy. This wasn't random bombardment, it was precise, adjusted in real time, and devastatingly effective. This system relied on forward observers who could quickly identify targets and relay coordinates. What shocked German soldiers was not just the firepower itself, but the speed of response. On other fronts, artillery could take much longer to organize, but here the delay was so short that any attempt to move, regroup, or counterattack could be punished almost instantly. One German officer later admitted that it created a sense of helplessness. You could plan an attack carefully, position your units, and begin advancing, only to have everything collapse under a sudden barrage. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about disruption. Every plan felt fragile. And then there was the sky. American air power played a constant and terrifying role in shaping the battlefield. Fighter bombers patrolled overhead, searching for movement. German soldiers learned quickly that daylight meant danger. Convoys that moved during the day were often spotted and attacked. Even individual vehicles could become targets. During operations like Operation Cobra, this combination of artillery and air power reached a new level. Massive bombing runs were used to break through defensive lines, followed immediately by ground forces exploiting the chaos. German units caught in these strikes described them as overwhelming, not just because of the explosions, but because of the coordination. Everything seemed to happen at once. Some survivors compared the experience to being trapped in a storm that you couldn't escape. The ground shook from artillery, while aircraft roared overhead, striking anything that moved. Communication lines were cut, units became isolated, and in that confusion, American forces advanced. But perhaps the most frustrating aspect for German troops was what happened after the battle. They would inflict damage, destroy tanks, disrupt formations, even push back advances. But the next day, it often felt as if nothing had changed. American units returned with fresh equipment, new supplies, and continued momentum. This was the result of something far beyond the battlefield: industrial power. The United States had built a war machine capable of producing enormous quantities of weapons, vehicles, and ammunition. And more importantly, it could deliver them to the front lines with remarkable efficiency. Convoys moved constantly, replacing losses faster than German forces could exploit them. German soldiers began to realize that they were fighting not just the units in front of them, but an entire system that could sustain itself indefinitely. Destroying a tank did not mean removing it from the war for long. Damaging a supply line did not guarantee lasting disruption. Everything seemed to be restored, often overnight. This had a powerful psychological effect. War is not only fought with weapons, but with expectations. And when soldiers begin to feel that their efforts are not producing lasting results, morale starts to shift. Some German prisoners later admitted that this was one of the difficult aspects to deal with. It created a sense that victory was slipping out of reach, not because of a single defeat, but because of a constant, grinding pressure. Even experienced veterans, men who had fought through some of the harshest conditions of the war, found themselves struggling to adapt. They were used to enemies who could be outmaneuvered or worn down over time. But this was different. This was an opponent that combined speed, firepower, and resources in a way that made traditional tactics less effective.
In their private conversations, many German soldiers didn't necessarily praise American tactics in the traditional sense. Instead, they focused on the results. They talked about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of this system, the sudden explosions, the constant threat from above, the frustration of seeing the enemy recover again and again. And slowly, a realization began to take hold. This was not just a battle between armies, it was a clash between ways of war. And in that clash, one side had found a way to turn coordination, technology, and industry into a force that was incredibly difficult to resist.
By the summer of 1944, German forces in Western Europe were already under immense pressure, but nothing fully prepared them for what followed after the Allied landings in the Normandy campaign. From the German perspective, the situation quickly turned into a battle not just for territory, but for survival against an enemy that seemed to control every dimension of the battlefield. In the days after the landings, German units attempted to contain the Allied forces along the coast. Experienced commanders believed that with fast counterattacks, they could push the invaders back into the sea. But those plans were constantly disrupted. Every movement was observed. Every concentration of troops risked drawing artillery fire or airstrikes. The very act of preparing an attack became dangerous. Soldiers described constant anxiety, knowing that one misstep could lead to immediate destruction. Morale began to fray as units that had once been confident started doubting their ability to withstand such relentless pressure. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had already warned about this reality. He understood that Allied air superiority would make it nearly impossible to maneuver during the day. In his view, the battlefield had changed. Movement, which had once been a key element of German success, was now restricted by the constant presence of enemy aircraft. German troops learned that even a small convoy or supply transport could be decimated before it reached the front lines, further complicating defensive operations. German soldiers on the ground felt this immediately. Columns that tried to advance were attacked from the air. Reinforcements moving toward the front were delayed or destroyed. Even communication between units became more difficult as infrastructure was targeted. The result was a growing sense of isolation. Units were fighting, but often without coordination, cut off from support that might never arrive. The psychological toll was immense, as soldiers realized that every action could be undone by overwhelming enemy coordination and firepower. When the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the situation escalated dramatically. German defensive lines, already stretched thin, were subjected to massive aerial bombardment. Survivors described the experience as overwhelming. The sheer volume of explosives, combined with the speed of the ground advance that followed, created a collapse that spread faster than commanders could react. Retreat became chaotic, and confusion among units was widespread, leaving gaps for the Allies to exploit further. General Fritz Bayerlein later spoke about the shock of these attacks. Units that had held their positions for weeks suddenly found themselves unable to function. Communication broke down, formations disintegrated, and retreat became the only option. It wasn't just defeat, it was disorganization on a scale that made recovery extremely difficult. Even seasoned commanders admitted that the scale and speed of the Allied advance was unlike anything they had encountered before. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, German troops continued to report the same problems. Any attempt to form a stable defensive line risked being shattered by artillery and air power. The front was no longer a fixed line, but something fluid, constantly shifting under pressure. Soldiers became increasingly aware that their opponents not only had superior resources, but also seemed to anticipate their moves almost instinctively, making every engagement a high-stakes gamble. Then, in the winter of 1944, came one last major effort to change the course of the war in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. For German soldiers, this offensive initially brought a sense of hope.
The attack achieved surprise, and in the early days, progress was made. American lines were pushed back, and confusion spread among Allied forces. But even in those first moments of success, familiar problems began to appear. As the offensive advanced, supply shortages quickly became an issue. Fuel was limited, ammunition had to be carefully managed, and as the weather cleared, American air power returned, striking relentlessly. German troops soon found themselves facing the same overwhelming response they had experienced before. Artillery strikes intensified, aircraft targeted advancing columns, roads became dangerous exposed routes where any movement could be detected and attacked. One German soldier later described the offensive as a race against time, a race they could not win. The initial momentum slowed, then stalled, and once it stalled, the full weight of the American response began to take effect. What made this particularly difficult was the contrast. German forces had achieved surprise, had broken through in places, had created an opportunity, but they could not sustain it. The system they were fighting against absorbed the Udar, reorganized, and pushed back with even greater force. The sheer scale and organization of American operations left German soldiers feeling powerless, even when they had numerical advantage in local engagements. For many German soldiers, this was the moment when any remaining illusions began to fade. They had seen what was possible when everything went right, and they had also seen how quickly those gains could be reversed. From Normandy to the Ardennes, the pattern was clear. No matter the terrain, no matter the conditions, the same challenges kept appearing. Firepower, speed, coordination, and the relentless ability to resupply created an almost unstoppable opponent. And as the war moved towards its final stages, those experiences would shape how German soldiers remembered the Americans they had fought, not just as an enemy, but as a force that was extraordinarily difficult to stop.
By the final months of the war, German soldiers captured by the Allies had already experienced firsthand the relentless power of the American military. Even those who had survived the Eastern Front, facing the massive Soviet offensives, repeatedly emphasized the same observation: nothing compared to American firepower. In private conversations, they admitted a growing respect for their enemy, even as they struggled with the reality of defeat. The lessons they learned under fire were recorded, sometimes secretly, and later analyzed to understand the unique nature of the American approach to warfare. One of the most striking stories came from Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld. During a desperate engagement in France, he risked his own life to save an American soldier trapped under fire. His actions were remarkable not only for their bravery, but for the insight they provide into the mindset of soldiers on both sides. Even in the chaos of battle, amidst fear and exhaustion, human courage and empathy could shine. For German soldiers witnessing this, it left a lasting impression. The Americans were not only overwhelming in combat power, but also capable of inspiring profound personal acts of courage in their opponents. Many POWs recalled how such acts affected morale, showing that despite the relentless nature of modern warfare, moments of humanity still emerged. Prisoners frequently remarked on the speed at which the Americans replaced losses. Tanks destroyed one day would be replaced almost overnight. Ammunition and supplies seemed endless, and wounded soldiers were quickly back on the front lines. German veterans often compared this to a form of industrial warfare that they had never seen before, a system that allowed the enemy to fight continuously without faltering. The psychological effect of this was enormous. It created a sense of inevitability, a realization that no matter how much they resisted, the Americans could absorb damage, adapt, and continue their advance. Soldiers described a growing feeling of futility, as even their most well-planned actions seemed unable to stop the enemy's momentum. Secret recordings from camps like Fort Hunt and Trent Park consistently captured this sentiment. Soldiers spoke candidly about the combination of artillery, air power, and logistics that made American forces so effective. They described how coordination between these elements created what they called a machine on the battlefield, one that was almost impossible to stop once it gained momentum. Even generals who had commanded panzer divisions admitted that facing Americans required a different mindset entirely. Tactics that worked on other fronts were often ineffective against this integrated system of combat. The depth of coordination between different branches of the American military left many German officers in awe and concern, recognizing that traditional strategies were no longer enough. The Battle of the Bulge provided another clear example. German troops initially achieved some tactical successes using surprise and local numerical advantages, but the Americans quickly responded with overwhelming firepower and rapid reinforcements. German soldiers noted that any gains were short-lived. The system, they realized, was self-correcting. The Americans could respond, recover, and counterattack faster than the Germans could exploit their initial victories. This repeated pattern reinforced the perception of American military efficiency and resilience. Over time, even junior soldiers began acknowledging that American strength lay not just in combat skill, but in the very way the war was organized and executed. Across Europe, the consensus among German POWs became unmistakable. The American way of war combined firepower, logistics, and tactical flexibility in a way that created a level of combat effectiveness previously unseen. Even when German soldiers tried to identify weaknesses, they struggled to find consistent vulnerabilities. They spoke about respect for the Americans, not because they were fearless, but because they had built an approach that was nearly impossible to overcome through conventional means. They also noted the discipline, training, and adaptation of American soldiers, which amplified the effect of their firepower. By the time the war ended, German veterans often reflected on these experiences in memoirs, interviews, and informal conversations. They acknowledged that the Americans had fundamentally changed the way war was fought. It was not merely about courage, training, or numbers. It was about the integration of technology, industry, and strategy into a single overwhelming force. Soldiers who had faced years of hardship in harsh conditions came to see the Americans as both formidable and, in many cases, admirable in their persistence and efficiency. The lessons they carried forward would influence military thinking for decades, highlighting the importance of coordination, logistics, and sustained firepower. In the end, German POWs left behind a remarkable record of honesty. Their assessments, recorded in secret or spoken in confidence, provide a unique lens on World War II. They reveal the human experience of facing an enemy that combined relentless firepower with unprecedented organizational skill. And most importantly, they show that even amidst destruction and fear, soldiers could recognize the exceptional qualities of those they fought against, a testament to the enduring complexity and humanity of war. Many reflected that understanding the Americans was not only about acknowledging their enemy, but also learning the full scale of what modern warfare could entail.